Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba back once again, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, with another video that is going to be rather provocative and controversial, as we're going to be talking about what does religion have to do with it. But before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe and the like button. Don't want anyone to ghost watching. But as I said it before, this is a very provocative, even controversial video, because we're going to be touching on an issue that is very near and dear to many people's hearts. That's the issue of religion and spirituality. Some of you may know, maybe a couple months back, I did a video on the role of black psychology and the important role that black psychology plays in African redemption. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how the role that religion plays, and so it's supporting or inhibiting African redemption at home and abroad. And I came about this because, I believe that in anything, you have to have a healthy critique of something. As you all may know, I am a Pan-Africanist. I am someone who believes in the political and economic unification of African people, for that we are able to gain the necessary power to control our own economic and political destiny. With that being said, I myself have critiqued Pan-Africanism, as many of us have. Pan-Africanism has been known, especially the flagship organization of Pan-Africanism, the African Union, as a toothless bulldog for setting standards and laws, but not being able to enforce and implement them. And then, of course, here in the Western world, I've argued that Pan-Africanism has been reduced to something that simply promotes cultural programming, where one learns their history, heritage, and culture, which is very good and very important, as we all know. Because we understand the miseducation machine is raging on as we speak. But oftentimes it doesn't go beyond that. And when I was back home in Dayton, shout out to the Gem City, I was part of an organization known as the Coalition of African Unity. Shout out to the CAU. And we believed in being self-determining in all aspects of life, all areas of human activity, as Queen Mother Frances Cress Welsing would say. As a result, one of the areas that we don't tend to critique is religion. So before we get started, just a little bit about my background. As many of you may know, I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in African-American studies, and I'm currently completing my PhD in higher education student affairs with a cognate specification in African-American perspective. So I think I have the bandwidth to discuss this issue. I think this is part of my wheelhouse. I also minored, of course, in religion in undergrad. But I think it's very important that we kind of talk about my positionality before we get into this. So I personally am an atheist, and many people may argue, why are you talking about issues of religion when you're an atheist? Obviously, you're going to have a biased opinion. And that's not necessarily the case. I personally believe that religion does play a positive role, right? It gives people a moral code to live by. Oftentimes, religious institutions allow people to have families that are able to socialize together in a safe space amongst like-minded individuals, so it creates a sense of community as well. But there's some other issues I think play a role in terms of that are detrimental to African people, and we will get into that a little bit later. But also, oftentimes, when we talk about atheism or black atheism, we know that we are a severe, very small minority. My parents are ministers, so when I had that conversation with them, they said Methodist. I said no, atheist, and as you can imagine, fireworks went off, right? But we're good now. But also, I think another issue that I think is very important is oftentimes people associate being an atheist with someone who is a Satanist, and that's not the case whatsoever. Satanist, of course, is someone who worships the devil or believes the devil is the supreme being, a higher power. As an atheist, we don't believe in any higher power of any kind whatsoever, irrespective of one's cultural background, so on and so forth. So just want to clear that up. But for myself, as a Pan-Africanist, I follow the Pan-Africanism of Carlos Cook. So for many of you who may not know, Carlos Cook was the ideological son of Marcus Garvey. Well, Marcus Garvey was, of course, falsely convicted of mail fraud, sent to prison in the federal prison in Atlanta, then deported to Jamaica. And of course, he later set up shop in the UK. Carlos Cook took over the Garvey movement, and he created the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. And one of the things that Carlos Cook did, and also for those of you who do not know, Carlos Cook was the preeminent Pan-Africanist orator, organizer in Harlem prior to Malcolm X's ascent in New York City. And Malcolm X even is quoted as stating that he learned more about Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism from Carlos Cook than from anyone. So we'll also want to make sure that we're showing love to our great ancestor, Carlos Cook, who was brought from the DR, by the way. And speaking of ancestors, we can't mention Pan-Africanism without mentioning some of the forefathers and foremothers of Pan-Africanism, such as Edward Wilmot Blyden, Henry Sylvester Williams, and of course the Queen Mother, Anna Julia Cooper. So when we talk about Carlos Cook, right, Garvey's organization, the motto was one God, one aim, one destiny. Carlos Cook came in, created the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. They were known for what? The anti-conking, right, movement. They didn't want brothers conking their hair. They didn't want sisters perming their hair. They wanted to promote black beauty. They had black beauty pageants, right? He promoted the don't work, don't buy where you can't work campaign on 125th Street in Harlem. But he also changed the motto of the Garvey movement from one God, one aim, one destiny to one cause, one goal, one destiny. And many people who were Garvey acolytes took issue with that. And they wrote to Garvey in London. He's removed God from the organization. How can we do what we're doing if we don't have a spiritual base? Garvey wrote back to Carlos Cook and said, good job. I should have done that a long time ago, because our people will rely on God to do for us what we should do for ourselves. And that's not something that is simply germane to black people. People throughout the world who are oppressed, marginalized, feel like they lack agency and the ability to be self-determining, tend to rely on God in the abstract to solve real-world tangible issues. For example, during the German Holocaust, many Jewish people who were in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and other extermination camps and concentration camps had a very strong religious fervor. But they couldn't depend on anything, of course, but their belief and faith in God. However, after the Holocaust ended, many Jewish people became atheists, if you could believe it or not, because there was a belief that if we are God's chosen people, you could put that in air quotes, right? Why and how did this happen to us? So what I'm saying is just simply to state that this is not something that's germane to black people, that, hey, if you believe in God or you depend on God to do what you should be doing for yourself, it's because there's something lacking in us. There's nothing innate about that. This is something that's germane to all people who feel that they like agency, self-determination, and an ability to create their own lives in the manner that they want. But with that being said, there are three issues that I really want to hammer home when we talk about what does religion have to do with it. First and foremost is most African people in the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, practice Abrahamic faiths. So when we talk about Abrahamic faiths, we're talking about religious beliefs that derive from the I would call pseudo-historical figure Abraham. You find Abraham, and of course, in the Quran, and the Torah, and the Pentateuch, and of course, the Bible. And there are three major faiths that come out of the Abrahamic tradition. That is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in their historical order: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And oftentimes what we find, I argue that all three of these religious beliefs are sites of anti-blackness. For example, in Judaism, there's a falsification of African history. In Judaism, when you read the Torah, the Pentateuch, it's stated that Abraham was the first person to believe in monotheism, one God. We, however, know, anyone who studied early African history, and I'm saying early African history as opposed to pre-colonial African history, because we don't want to center African history around European excursion of the continent. We know that the first person of human record to practice monotheism was Pharaoh Akhenaten. We know Akhenaten was a black man because his mother was Queen Tai of Nubia. So that's a falsification of African history. And so as a result, that will cause you to devalue your own history, heritage, and culture and religious beliefs due to what the narrative of another cultural group's religion. Secondly, when we talk about falsification of African history, the story of Jewish enslavement in Egypt, right? We understand that anyone who's ever studied Jewish history, anyone who's ever studied the Bible from an academic standpoint, not from someone who you go to church and you're in Sunday school and you believe everything they're telling you, that that's not something that even happened. There's a great book called The Bible Unearthed by Jewish scholars that talk about the fact that the Exodus, or the story of Jewish enslavement, was created during the reign of King Josiah as a way to build national morale and a belief in the nation. moving to Christianity, as we all know, many people would argue that this is a slave religion, right? If you ever get a chance to study slave revolts, the impetus for slave revolts was what? African cultural tension and religious beliefs. We all know the most famous and successful slave revolt in the history of the world was the Haitian Revolution. And we know that Book Mandata stated, reject their white God, embrace your African spirit, you are free. He didn't say you can be free. He didn't say you would be free. He didn't say you shall be free. He said you are free. And then we went out there and we kicked Napoleon's derriere. But also, if you ever get a chance to study slave narratives or slave revolts, and even Frederick Douglass's memoir, he talks about that the Africans, our brothers and sisters, our ancestors who acquiesced and adopted the religious beliefs of our enslavers, not only did they have low status on the plantation and the slave community, but they also were the ones that were most amenable and docile to the institution of enslavement. That's one issue. Number three, even when we talk about, and of course Christianity is this issue where people talk about the curse of Ham, the Hamitic curse, right? And so I was having a conversation once with my brother, and my brother said, well, at least when you go to church, you learn to have a relationship with the Father. And I said the whole concept of God being simply a man, there's not being a duality in terms of the divine energy, is something that is purely Eurocentric. We know in African religious beliefs, you have male and female in all things. And if you don't have both working together in harmony, you have chaos. This is where the Yak comes from out of ancient Egypt. Number three, we talk about Islam, right? We know many African Americans have moved from Christianity to Islam. I would consider that a lateral move. Many people would ask, why? And I'm going to tell you why. We don't understand that many people associate Islam with militancy because of the Nation of Islam, because of Malcolm X, and even if some people know the history, because of Noble Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple of America, that were for many people the precursor to the Nation of Islam in terms of a black religious nationalism that sought to, in a very audacious manner, reject white hegemony in all areas of human life and activity. However, Islam has a more sordid history with black people than Christianity, if you could believe that, right? And we know even in Judaism, there's a seed of anti-blackness, and you can see how the Ethiopian Jews are treated, right? In Israel and in other aspects of a Jewish life and culture. But also, when we go back to Islam, one of the things that we find is that there was Islamic enslavement of African people before there was what? Christian enslavement of African people, right? So we know even in Islam, it states in the Quran, if you are not a Muslim, you could be enslaved. And it even says if you're not a good Muslim, you could be enslaved. And Dr. Claude Anderson, in his book, Black Labor, White Wealth, he even talks about the role that Islam played in breaking down the great Western Sudanic nation states of Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, right? And so once again, we have to be aware of these warring ideologies, right, that play a role in trying to undermine African self-determination. With that being said, I think it's also important to highlight some of the forms of self-abnegation that takes place. I would argue self-abnegation is a pseudo-sophisticated religious way of someone trying to distance themselves from their black identity as a way of trying to escape anti-black racism. And we find that with many African people stating that they're Hebrew Israelites, right? But if anyone knows anything about African history is that black history predates Judaism. Black history predates the stories in the Bible, right? We already had civilizations that were the highest forms of civilization the world had ever known during antiquity, while these stories were even still being created, right? And we all know that if you go back and look at antiquity, there were three ancient cultures. There was the Indus Valley culture in India, Pakistan. You had the Nile Valley civilization in ancient Egypt, and then you had, of course, the Fertile Crescent in what is present-day Iraq. So Israel or Hebrew people, they weren't even on the map when we was out running things, right? So I think it's very important to understand that as well. But one of the issues I really want to harp on is, especially when we talk about the black church. When I say black church, we're talking about black religious institutions, is oftentimes they promote a lack of financial transparency. And what do I mean by that? Oftentimes, you're taught to just believe in the religious leader. If it be the imam, the rabbi, or the pastor, you're not supposed to question them because they're being led by God, and as a result, that allows them to oftentimes engage in nefarious financial activities that actually to our detriment. For example, I can recall being 11 years old, going to a revival where the preacher was very charismatic, and was actually preaching and promoting what I would later come to find out was known as what? The prosperity gospel. When he talked, he had a silver tongue, as they state, right? And he was talking about if you want to reap, you have to sow a seed. You want to reap a blessing, you got to sow a seed. Sow a seed of $50, sow a seed of $100, sow a seed of $500, and you will reap a financial blessing. When any reasonable, sensible adult understands that if I give a man some money that I don't know, I'm not going to all of a sudden make a lot of money off of that, right? That's not how an investment works. And I remember, I'm like, okay, man, this guy's talking a lot. I want to go home. I think the NBA Finals was on, right? We get home the next morning. You know, my dad is at work. I asked my mom, it's summertime. Hey, Mom, can I get a dollar so I can go to the store and buy some pop? My mom looked at me and said, I don't have $1. I said, why not? She looked at me with a look that told me she knew she had been duped. And she said, I gave all my money to that preacher. And my mom was a very intelligent woman. She said, I gave all that money to that preacher. 20 years later, we had a conversation about that. I said, what were you thinking? And she told me she knew she had been duped because she cut the check Sunday evening. Monday morning, wake up, check their account, the check had already cleared, right? So I think that's an issue as well, to where oftentimes in these religious institutions, the lack of financial transparency has been taking place because people are led to be gullible and rely on faith, not sight, which I believe if that's the case, you might as well be a blind person, right? And that's no disrespect to anyone who's blind, but you need to go into things knowing what's going on, having a plan. And another issue I think that takes place in many religious institutions is institutionalized cultural nationalism. So we know oftentimes when we look at the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, many black people were leaving Christianity but making a lateral move to Islam. And so as a result, they were taking on Islamic names and customs. The most famous would be Lou Alcindor changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, which is an Islamic name. And as a result, this is just another form of what? Anti-blackness, right? You're not going to the root, you're going to a different cultural or historical experience. But also, I remember having a conversation with my brother where we talked about the black church. And I said there are some positives. Once again, growing up in a safe environment, like-minded values, you're able to fellowship and coalesce with people who view the world the way you do. Very important. But you even engage in public speaking at a very early age. I can recall giving Easter Sunday speeches where you have to remember the speech and go up in front of people and be articulate and bloviate and resort to histrionics to move the crowd at a very early age. So there's some positives that could come out of the institutional black church. But I said there's a bigger issue I have to focus on. Where do most black people learn about their history, heritage, or culture? It isn't at home, unfortunately. It isn't in school, right? It unfortunately oftentimes is the church. And what does the church, whether it be Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, teach black people about their history, heritage, and culture? They teach us that is what? Devil worship, witchcraft, voodoo, etc. Any black person who learns this, hey, that's going to lead to what? Self-hatred. Self-hatred leads to what? Engaging in racially disempowering, self-defeating, self-destructive behavior. Because if you don't value your person, what? You will engage in what? What we know oftentimes is at-risk behavior. So I said it's fair to say that the so-called institution that is saving your soul is actually the instrument of your own damnation. So I would argue that if any person of African descent was to practice a religious belief, it should be congruent with their own history, heritage, or culture. So that means if it's an African religion, if we're talking about looking at Yoruba faith, if we're talking about even the African-inspired religions, such as Rastafari, or Badun, or Santeria, I believe it is very important to practice a religious belief that is culturally congruent with who we are as a people. Because as I've stated before, and Dr. Jacob Carruthers in his groundbreaking book, everyone should make sure they go out and check it out. Intellectual Warfare really focuses on this, that religion is nothing more than institutionalized cultural nationalism, where aspects of a culture are raised to a religious level and then disseminated as something that came down from heaven, which we know, of course, any rational thinking person knows that is not the case. And so I believe it's very important that we understand the manner and method in which these cultural institutions, these alien religions, play a role in inhibiting African progress, African self-determination and African redemption at home and abroad. Because you can't truly be an unapologetically African, unapologetically black person if you are practicing an alien religious belief. Because those religious beliefs teach that the cultures that they disseminated from, and the people that created those cultures, are closer to God than anyone else. So in Judaism, if you believe in somehow, shape, or form in that type of belief system, you have to at some point believe that God is more connected to Jewish people than black people. And as I stated before, we know there are many black people who would argue we're really Jewish people. But as I said all the time, and if you ever get a chance to read Anthony T. Blotter's book, Now Valley Contribution to Civilization, we predate Jewish history. We predate those stories by thousands of years, right? Same with Christianity, same with Islam. In Islam, you're taught that Arabic is the language of God. You're taught that the holiest places in the world are in Arabia. But how convenient if you're Arabic, right? But if you're not, you have to almost take on this type of Arabic cultural grooming to become a true Muslim, right? And as last but not least, in the Islamic faith, there's actually a term called abda, which means it's synonymous with, it means black, but it's synonymous with slave. And I've even had some brothers and sisters from the Horn of Africa who, they know I'm a Pan-Africanist, we talk about some issues, and they stated, you know, I am a Muslim, but I really have an issue with my religion because it promotes anti-blackness, because of these different methods and ideas in the Arabic culture that are allowed to seep into the Islamic faith. So once again, thank you all for listening. I know this is a longer video than I oftentimes do, but once again, what does religion have to do with it? I think it's very important that we make sure that we're not engaging in culturally misorienting behavior and our religious practices that inhibit us from reaching our true potential as a free, proud, and productive African people. Thanks once again. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Peace.